Welcome back, everyone. Today we have a sad video, but it's also not that sad because we are almost at 100 subscribers on this channel. So if you're seeing this video and there are 99 subscribers, you could be the 100th subscriber. And if there's more than 100, then still nothing's stopping you from subscribing. But anyways, let's just jump into this game, which I'm kind of reluctant to do, but it is for the content. This is what I probably think is the worst game I've ever played for many, many reasons. So, just to set the scene, this is the 2020 Idaho Closed, so the 2020 state championship. This game was played more than 4 years ago. This is the sixth round, so the last round. At this point, I had gotten 4.5 out of 5, and everyone else had 4 or below. So, if I won this game, that would just win me the tournament immediately. And if I drew the game, then I would at least tie. So obviously, I should just try to win the game and win the tournament outright. But instead, 4 years ago, I was very scared, and especially of this opponent because I lost to him the last year too. So my plan was just to make a draw with white, which is something you should never do, basically. But before this, let's actually look at the game before, just to show that this game wasn't even because I was having a bad tournament. So let's this is the game before, and I actually won this game very, very quickly. So let's look at this really quick. This game I played this opening, and I also played this opening against my opponent's friend in round 3, and that game was a draw. So we basically played the exact same moves until this point, where my opponent played queen to e2. So this move is trying to stop knight to c4, and here I spent a lot of time, and I sacked the rook, and I spent, I think, about 28 minutes, and I sacrificed the rook. And after the game, my opponent actually said that he and his friend had been looking at this line, and they were considering rook takes c3, but they were like, okay, James isn't going to play rook takes c3, and I did. So my opponent takes, I play queen c7, I'm attacking the pawn. c4, I cannot actually draw arrows, which is a little bit unfortunate. So I put more pressure on the pawn. My opponent plays knight to b5. I take, and now my opponent makes a huge blunder with taking with the c pawn, trying to undouble the pawns, but instead it just gave me an open lane. Instead, he should have taken with the a pawn, and then I would have had a protected passed pawn on the a file, but at least this pawn is kind of blocking my queen and rook. White would be up in exchange and wouldn't have too many problems. However, after this, I just play queen to c3, infiltrating over here. Now I can do some knight sacks and open up my bishop also. And black is completely winning now, and my opponent just plays bishop to d4, sees that the bishop is pinned, and resigns immediately. So after this game, now I have 4.5 out of 5, and now let's actually look at this main game, which is really, really bad. Okay, so let's go back to this. Let's go back to the main scene. Okay, so in this game, I played pawn to e4. I'm now white. My opponent plays c5, and he plays e6, so the French variation. And normally, I would play pawn to d4 almost every time. However, I really want a draw for some reason, and I can't explain it. This was 4 years ago. So instead, I don't play d4, and that just doesn't make any sense because it just doesn't. And then my opponent plays knight to c6, now I play bishop e2. So it's very, very clear that I'm just trying to put myself in a box and hope that the box doesn't collapse, which is one of the worst strategies of making a draw. Usually when you should make a draw, when you want to make a draw, what you should do is just play a normal game, try to win if you can, and if you can't win, then you probably draw instead. But if you try to draw, if that doesn't work out, you lose instead. So that's why so the easiest way to get a draw is to play for a win, but I either didn't know that or didn't believe in it or something, but I just never played d4. And instead, my opponent plays d5, and now black just equalizes, has a really nice center. I take. Now I can still play d4, but I was scared of these doubled pawns, even though it doesn't really matter. I can just develop my bishop over here or something. Instead, I take the knight, and now this is probably the first move that decides the rest of the game. I played d3, which is not a good move. I mean, when you play moves like this, it just doesn't make your position better. So my opponent plays bishop e7 now, I play bishop e3, bishop f6. My opponent's playing very logically, very nice pieces in the center. Now he's attacking this b2 pawn. This bishop is also on a good diagonal. I play queen to d2, so now I'm trying to cheese him with this trap pawn to c4. That's basically my entire plan. So obviously this opening has not really worked out, so this is also probably one of the worst openings I've played, which is really saying something. And now he castles, I play rook e1. I'm still trying to hope that he takes the pawn. Obviously he does not, so now I have to play c3. and now he has really good bishops on these diagonals, and good control of the center, and I'm just basically hiding behind my pawns, and I can't really go anywhere with my pieces. So I try to trade the bishops, because my opponent already has moves like knight to e5, and rook to d8, targeting this pawn, also targeting this diagonal. So I trade a bunch of pieces, and now at least I'm not losing the game immediately due to all my opponent's active pieces. So my opponent plays e5, and this is now the middle game slash end game. My opponent has a good pawn chain here and good control of this d4 square, and this pawn is also kind of a backward pawn. This is going to be his target. I play bishop to f3, probably one of the only logical moves in the entire game. Just putting pressure on this diagonal, pinning the knight, and also threatening to trade and take this pawn if this f6 move wasn't a thing. So my opponent plays h6, I play knight to e4, I'm trying to go to d6, my opponent stops it with rook d8. I go rook to d1, rook d7, now I play knight to g3. Now I have this pin again, I kind of want to take and take. My opponent plays here, so if I take immediately, then my opponent actually takes this pawn, and if I trade everything, this rook is just way too active, and my rook cannot check, and there's just the back rank threat followed by bishop to b5, which would pick up the knight. So if I make error with h3, then it's probably too slow. My opponent can either go like this, or play even stronger, play king f8 first. Now my rook can never really enter. Knight f5 is probably met by eventually like check. And whenever I play rook e7, there's just g6 winning the knight or bishop d7. So this variation is okay. I try to play knight. So instead I play. Oh, I do it anyway, and I play knight to f5. So instead of taking the pawn, I play knight to f5. Now I'm hoping that if he takes, I can get a fork. However, my opponent correctly plays king to f8, guarding this e7 square, which is a very nice move. Now I take the pawn, he takes. I do not trade because then we get kind of the same problem as before. Instead I play rook to e1. Now we get rook to d2, attacking this pawn. Now black's rooks are probably faster than mine because he just gets here first. So I play rook to e7, he takes, I take. What he could have done was play bishop to d7. This would have been a little more accurate. It's attacking the knight, it's also blocking off my rook, and now when I move the knight, now he can take my pawn and I can't take his pawn, and I just basically lose the game because I lose these pawns. However, he doesn't see that, he takes immediately instead, which is still okay. Now he goes rook to e2, a nice move I can't take because of the back ranked threat, so I play rook to f1. Now we get bishop to b5, lining up some discovered attacks on the rook, and here I can actually play knight to e3, followed by moves like maybe c4, possibly playing for this d5 square, or a4 and a5 to try to trade off as many pawns as I can. Because if I can trade off pawns, then even if I can trade off these pawns, even if I lose another pawn, if I trade off this, then 3 versus 2 pawns should be a draw. Instead I play this move g4, which looks kind of insane, but I'm basically trying to not only create lift for my king, but I'm also going to protect this knight so that rook to e5 doesn't attack it anymore. So my opponent plays rook to e4, attacking the pawn. Now my plan was to play f3, attacking this rook, protecting this pawn. My opponent takes, I take, and now bishop to h3. Okay, so we've gotten a lot of trades. Black is not actually up a pawn, however, I cannot really protect this pawn. If I play knight to e3, we get rook to d3, and I can actually check here and check a bunch. However, it looks kind of scary for white due to these threats. So instead, I play rook to b7, trying to take this pawn. Now my opponent takes, and now kind of a surprising move. My opponent checks once and then takes my knight. So he takes my knight. Usually rook versus bishop, rook and bishop is better than a rook and a knight, but I think my opponent might have been worried about moves like rook to b8 check, but he didn't have to check me first. Instead, he can just play like g6, kick my knight out. If I take, I think my knight gets trapped on the side here. But instead he takes my knight after checking me. And now, in this rook and pawn endgame, I'm not down a pawn yet, so he actually has to take a pawn. And once he takes one of my pawns, I can maybe take one of his pawns. And this looks like it should be a draw. So, what actually happened in this game? Well, apparently, at this point, I was really, really bad at endgames. Like, I had just a really poor understanding of anything to do when you have rooks on the board and pawns. And this endgame it's not even losing, because although I have 4 pawn islands and my opponent has 2, I have a passed pawn here, and I also have this target on c5. But when he checks me, now I have 6 moves with the king. So pause the video and try to figure out, first of all, where would you put the king, and also where do you think I put the king? Okay, so if you said king to g3, then congratulations, you know how to play endgames, you're protecting this pawn, and after black takes this pawn, you want to play rook to c6 or rook to b5, take this pawn, and with a passed pawn, and also when you protect this f5 pawn with the rook, white has little to zero losing chances. So if you played this, congratulations, you just became the Idaho State champion, because the other 2 people with 4 points drew, so they would have only had 4.5 out of 5. However, I play this insane move, king to e3. I'm trying to activate the king. Activate the king is good in endgames, right? Well, yes, it is, but not when you lose 2 pawns instead. But even after this, if I attack this pawn and my opponent takes, this is probably still kind of maybe a draw. It's very difficult because although I have a pawn, my opponent has a pawn majority over here. But instead, I play h4, and now my opponent plays rook to h2, and now I go here. And we got the same thing, basically. But this king to e3 move just basically made the endgame really, really hard to play for white. Instead of just protecting the pawn like a normal person, now I just lose this pawn, but I can win this pawn back and it's a draw. But instead, after I lose this pawn, it's really difficult to play, and my opponent actually does a nice move. He checks me first, attacking this pawn. Also, if my opponent can take this pawn, it's a really easy win because this pawn runs down here, and my opponent also has a majority here, so I have to go back, and then I take, and this is basically just a much worse version because my king is farther away. So by pushing this pawn, I actually lost an extra tempo. So very, very cool. Now my opponent plays rook to h5, which is, he's trying to pin the pawn to my rook. My opponent can also play king to e7 and king to f6, getting to the pawn. And basically, all my ideas are too slow. I can't push this pawn fast enough, and my opponent will start pushing this pawn. And I also lose this pawn, which is nice. Not really, though, because if I lose this pawn, now he has 3 pawns versus 1. So I play c4, he takes. I can't take because he has just too many pawns. So I play here, h5, g5, king d4. Now my opponent trades rooks. And I thought that if I could maybe take this pawn, then it would maybe be a draw, but he just plays f5, check, very nice. Because if I take this pawn, the pawn promotes. If I take this pawn, as I did in the game, plays h4, and this pawn positioning like this makes like a wall, so I can't take this pawn. I also can't take this pawn because now it's too slow. So now I basically just make a few more moves, and I don't really want to resign, so instead I let him checkmate me. But anyways, that is how I throw the 2022 Idaho Closed. I had 4.5 out of 5. All I needed was at least a draw or a win. Instead, I tried to draw, and I lost instead. And the game was basically psychologically over on move 3, where I had just admitted to being scared of playing an actual game. And that doesn't even make any sense, because when I played my opponent in the last tournament, I played basically this opening, and I was very close to beating him. But instead, I played all these very scared, cowardly moves, and as a result of that, I had a really bad position for basically the entire game. And the only good moves here were basically this sequence over here when I traded pieces and played bishop to f3. This gave me at least half of a chance to fight back. However, once we got to this endgame, black was probably better for a lot of this endgame, but my opponent actually gave me a really good chance to draw by trading the bishop for the knight and going to the rook endgame. However, I don't know if you knew this or not, but I just didn't know how to play rook endgames at all, so I just played really illogical moves, and I lost the game instead. So after this game, I was obviously very upset, and I just focused on endgames for a lot of my studying. I just studied a bunch of endgames, especially rook endgames. I went through some endgame books, and now I'm less bad at endgames, and actually, I can actually say that I understand why some of these moves were bad. So overall, this was a very sad tournament, and so were the next 2 tournaments after this. I also lost some really sad games in those following state championships. However, in the next 2, I actually won, and those you can watch those videos they're linked in a playlist. So thank you for watching this kind of a sad video, but it's not that sad because we're almost nearing 100 subscribers. So please subscribe and try to get this channel to 100 subscribers, and then we're going to do probably a special video. It might also be a collaboration with one of my friends who's also close to 100 subscribers. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.